Eso nos indica a nosotros dos cosas. Primero, la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantico.
Hello! Yet another new series that I'll have a difficult time adding additional episodes to before I inevitably lose interest. For the uninitiated, the CIA is a terrorist organization that carries out the dirty work of American ruling interests domestically as well as abroad, against the interests of the American people. Coups, assassinations, the restrictions of personal rights, as well as downright crazy nonsense that the best dystopian novels have a hard time replicating. You name it, the CIA has meddled, bombed, murdered, or interfered in. Today's CIA operation of note is Operation Northwoods, or, more clickbaitily, how the US planned to murder innocent American civilians in order to justify war with Cuba. Introduction and background. The date is January 1st, 1959. The heroic guerrillas of the July 26th movement seized power in Havana as the disgraced US-backed dictator Batista fled the island, emptying the nation's coffers and stealing upwards of $500 million worth of cash, art, and assets. What an upstanding citizen he is. Speaking of assets, Batista himself was a direct asset to the United States. Cuban agriculture was barred from development. Instead, it was used as a sugar subsidy for the world's largest economy, the United States. Batista himself facilitated the direct American ownership of the vast majority of arable land within Cuba, as well as the ownership of most businesses too. The American mafia got their hand in there as well, with not too uncertain support from US intelligence themselves. Those same US intelligence members, too, had stakes in many businesses within Cuba, as well as the rest of Latin America. Cuba was no more than an American military base, populated by bars, casinos, brothels, and an illiterate peasant population under the thumb of a US-backed dictator. Incredibly romantic. With the fall of America's dictator within Cuba, a new era began. Literacy programs, the building up of industry, new trade agreements with the world, women's rights, successful attempts at correcting the horrific racial biases that existed on the island, and so much more was put into motion. At first, the revolutionary government was willing to cooperate with the US, but the US had other ideas. What the Cubans wanted would have directly affected the profits of those Americans that have presided over Cuban agriculture and industry. Most of them, as previously mentioned, being intimately connected to American ruling structures as well. American-owned and ran companies within Cuba simply refused to work with the government of Cuba, refusing to refine oil, to pass paperwork, or to even listen to the requests of Cuban delegates. Try that in the United States. With American refusal standing progressive policies, the revolutionary government of Cuba nationalized industry and returned Cuban soil and Cuban assets into Cuban hands. The United States, in turn, responded by placing on Cuba some of the severest economic sanctions history has known, colloquially referred to as the embargo. The motivations were simple. In a declassified file, they listed their motivations as clear as day. Number 1, the majority of Cubans support Castro. The lowest estimate I have seen is 50%. Number 2, there is no effective political opposition. Number 3, Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence. So do I. Number 4, communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. Number 5, militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. Number 6, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through the disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. If the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision, which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This is an American policy that began in 1960 and hasn't yet ended in 2021. But this wasn't enough. US President Eisenhower in 1960 alone gave the CIA $13.1 million to use against the new Cuban government. Accounting for inflation, that's $121 million in today's money. Not for education, or healthcare, or jobs, or infrastructure in the US, but to overthrow a people's government to secure further profits for a handful of people at the American top. Regardless, they couldn't just stop at this, so in 1961, the United States officially sponsored and supported a clandestine invasion of Cuba by a military force directly trained by them. This was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This American adventure failed spectacularly, with Che Guevara remarking, "Nothing strengthens people's support in a revolutionary government like a US-backed invasion." Of course, the CIA got to work immediately planning another invasion in 1962, but that was quickly scrapped as Kennedy saw that another US failure would permanently ruin America's global reputation, as if that hadn't happened already. That definitely didn't stop them, though, from developing Operation Northwoods. In 1962, a plan was concocted by the US Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in which many possibilities for starting a war with Cuba, based on false pretenses, were discussed, outlined, and planned. These included assassinations of Cuban immigrants, sinking of boats and shooting down planes carrying civilians, and acts of terror within US cities. To quote, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents, and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement would also be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government." These proposals were approved at every level of US government until it reached Kennedy, who was the final person to look it over and eventually reject the proposal. Not from some love for peace, mind you, but because he was worried that the military forces that would be diverted to Cuba would be better used in Berlin or Vietnam. The proposal itself was presented in a document titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, which outlined the general invasion plan of Cuba by the U.S. Number 1, aggressive military posturing against Cuba intended to provoke a Cuban reaction. Number 2, a series of well-coordinated false flag incidents planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give a genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. Number 3, United States response by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying artillery and mortar emplacements which threaten Guantanamo. This includes the admitted civilian targets. Number 4, commence large-scale United States military operations within Cuba. Keep in mind, Guantanamo is Cuban soil illegally occupied by the US. Their general plan was to provoke an attack on a US military base that has no business being there in a sovereign and independent nation, and then to respond with overwhelming force against said nation, expanding the occupation from a naval base to the whole island. This also neatly ties into Operation Mongoose. Amongst the plans to kill American civilians in order to justify invasion of Cuba, the CIA also outlined many plans for the assassination of Fidel Castro and other leaders of the revolution. Almost every false flag operation planned had the expressed intention of justifying a war with Cuba, even for unrelated events. For example, Operation Dirty Trick, rightfully named, has the expressed goal of blaming failed US space missions on Cuba. To quote, "The objective is to provide irrevocable proof that, should the Mercury manned orbital flight fail, the fault lies with the communists et al. Cuba. This is to be accomplished by manufacturing various pieces of evidence which would prove electronic interference on the part of the Cubans." They even went as far as to plan false, quote-unquote, Cuban invasions of nearby countries, which could give the US an excuse to intervene. To quote, "A contrived Cuban attack on an Organization of American States member could be set up, and the attacked state could be urged to take measures of self-defense and request assistance from the US and the OAS. The US could almost certainly obtain the necessary two-thirds support amongst OAS members for collective action against Cuba." Hilariously, there is an official, highly sanitized publication that details American interventions and war crimes called the National Security Archive, which basically cycles between, we didn't do it, and if we did do it, then we were justified in doing it. Highlighted areas of action were, to quote, anti-Castro propaganda, disruption of the Cuban economy, including large-scale sabotage operations, and the development of instructor cadres to provide both communications and paramilitary training to resistance groups. Under the Mongoose operation, over a dozen major operations were authorized and carried out, including military attacks on sugar mills, railways, power plants, and oil refineries. One of the industrial facility attacks resulted in the death of 400 workers, with Kennedy's direct approval. According to the historian Stephen Rabe, and I quote, "The Kennedy administration showed no interest in Castro's repeated request that the United States cease its campaign of sabotage and terrorism against Cuba. Kennedy did not pursue a dual-track policy towards Cuba. The United States would entertain only proposals of surrender." Rabe's research further shows how US-backed groups would stage hit-and-run attacks on Cuban ships transporting goods, and on the island itself. Historian Jorge Dominguez further documents that, and to quote, "Only once in the 1,000 pages of documentation did a US official raise something that resembled a faint moral objection to US government-sponsored terrorism." According to Chomsky, in the end, the entire failed endeavor to oust the revolutionary government of Cuba cost upwards of several hundreds of millions of dollars, if not even billions. Again, not for healthcare or education of American citizens, but for the profits of a few casino moguls and US businessmen with lost stakes in Cuban industry. Tell me about risk under capitalism again. This series of constant meddling and provocation by the US began in 1960 and has not ended since. Not only this, but this is only scratching the surface of US meddling in Cuban affairs. There's a lot more that is equally horrific and has been declassified, and God knows how much more remains classified. If anything, this just reinforces another quote from the great helmsman: "US imperialism is the most ferocious enemy of the people of the entire world." And that's all for this time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Aisha, Zachary Brenner, Paul Benazet Montobia, Daryl, Introvert Ancom, Nyankat, Bruce, Jaffe, Lucky Sphere, Justin Cosby, Benny Shuckout, Zach Albrecht, Marku, CF, Hannah, Nigin Juniper, Kevin Shepard, Orion Cleaver, Tommy Harding, Sam Bam, Dominic Trujillo, Aaron, Astra the Gay Reptile, Chase Wall, and Chairman Bruh. Thanks for watching.